morning, Chief Superintendent.
Morning, sir.
Miss Graham.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning.
Could I return to the aid memoir that we looked at yesterday? I know we're going back to something we dealt with. This is PS 18503. It's on the screen now, if that makes life easier. I really just want to ask you, because I didn't ask yesterday, you'd mentioned that the PIM log was a style format that you'd been given at a training course. Where did this aid memoir come from?
So this the same training course.
Right. So was this for an English training course that you'd then taken to use on the 3rd of May 2015?
Yeah, so at the time it was Kent and Sussex Police were deemed to be leading PIM training across the UK, so they came up and trained a number of us in Scotland.
And that wasn't a document that was typed up by you then, it was
No.
a style that you found in the papers?
That's right.
Thank you. We were also going through the PIM log yesterday, PS 00387, and I'd like you to look at another copy that we have of this PIM log. Now, there are additional sheets at the back, and some of them have handwriting on them. So this is PS 05536. And if we can look at the very back of that, so my version is pages 37 and 39. Can you move that slightly so I can check? This is page 39. Can we start with 37, please? Now, it's been drawn to our attention that the copy that was in your the hard copy that you looked at yesterday, that we looked at yesterday, did not have these additional pages at the rear. And in fairness to you, I don't want to leave anything out that you might think is significant. So this is a typed paper which is headed up Burnley Post-Incident Procedures Personal Welfare Strategy. Is there anything that was this part of your PIM log?
So it's not part of the log. So this is a standalone document that I produced either the day after or a couple of days after the 3rd of May. So within the PIM SOP, it talks about developing a welfare strategy for the officers for the ongoing welfare support as the process evolves. So this is beyond day one of the post-incident procedure. So what I decided to do was to document what that strategy would look like, which is the document we're looking there, which is it's just a one-page sort of explanation of what we were going to do. And then we basically, so there was a transition between post-incident management and line management. So the line management started to take on the greater burden of that welfare support in the days after the day of the incident. So this was a way of documenting what needed to happen and allowing that sort of formal handover, if you like, between myself as a post-incident manager and the line management. So there's a document that you're seeing at the moment, which is what we're going to do with each officer, and then line management then sat with each officer and went through that document and recorded this. So I don't know if you scroll up, if there's then a template afterwards, which I called Appendix A.
There is a...
Yeah, so this template that you're now seeing, effectively the inspector, I think it was Alan Seath was the inspector at the time who took on that line management responsibility. So he sat with each officer, went through the strategy and the questions in the strategy and or the points in the strategy, and completed this template for each officer. And obviously, depending on what the officer said, depends on what's recorded here and what action would be taken to support their welfare in the days and weeks following the incident. And that was also, if you like, the handover point between the post-incident process and the more normal line management welfare support process.
We'll see Alan Seath's name in your PIM log shortly when I come back to that.
Yeah.
So this was a standalone paper, not actually part of your PIM log.
That's right, yeah.
And when you mentioned page 37, you said you prepared that document for the purposes of the handover to line management. When did you prepare that document?
So it was either on the Monday or the Tuesday, so it was one of the
The 4th or the 5th of
Yeah,
May?
it was just in the immediate. I've probably put in the PIM log when I spoke to Alan about it, so it would be in the days, the day before that I produced it, but in the immediate aftermath.
And then you'll see on page 39 that there's some handwritten notes on a sheet of A4.
Yeah.
Is this your writing?
So this is my writing.
I just wanted you to confirm whether or not there was anything significant that you've written on that page that you felt you maybe didn't have yesterday, that maybe you didn't have yesterday and you didn't have available to look at.
Yeah. So again, this is a standalone piece of A4 paper. This isn't part of the PIM log.
Right.
So I have no recollection of actually writing these notes. And just a short time ago is the first time I've seen them since 2015. So just to be clear on that, so my assessment of this is that these are the notes that I wrote during the teleconference. So if you, and it actually, in my mind, it explains why I was able to complete the log, the sitrep section of the log in some detail when I got to Kirkcaldy. So 1124 I've written in the PIM log as we discussed yesterday, and obviously in the sitrep section I've put a series of notes. And actually when I now look at this document, these are the same notes with a little bit more detail in them, but essentially the same notes that I've copied across into the PIM log when I've got to Kirkcaldy. So this isn't a formal document. This is an A4 bit of paper that I've scribbled on as that teleconference is ongoing. But the content of it, if we went through it, is almost identical to the notes that I copied into the PIM log, notwithstanding some details are missing from the PIM log that are in this.
And do we also see that PC Shaw's name is mentioned, which you explained yesterday was a typo?
So that should be PC, and that's where the typo originated
Should
from.
be
Then
Nicole
is indeed, and that again, that was copied into that page 2 of the PIM log that we went through yesterday.
And then if we go up, because so people can see this on the screen, you mentioned 9:10 critical incident.
Yeah.
And that was prior to your teleconference, which was, I think we said 9:30.
9:30 the teleconference started, that's right.
And you mentioned Superintendent Craig Hall.
So my recollection, he was the on-call professional standards superintendent, so I didn't really have any direct engagement with him, but I've obviously just jotted his name down when it's been referenced in the teleconference.
Okay. And then there's mention, if we can carry on going down the page, FedRep with the officers.
Yeah.
PIM approach, what does that mean?
So I think that is when we discussed yesterday about Chief Super Gary McEwen saying I think post-incident procedures is appropriate for this situation, and the ACC agreeing with that and making the decision to appoint a post-incident manager. And that's where I've written that PIM approach, and if you remember also there was the instruction to me to move from Dundee to Kirkcaldy, and that's essentially what I've noted there.
And then the next line, female report, what does that actually say?
So I don't know. So female report male, and then that next word, I mean it's ing and it begins with an M, but I'll be honest, I'm not sure what that word actually is.
I'm not going to make any suggestions.
Apologies, I don't know. And then obviously there's an arrow reference in a victim. So it suggests to me that a female is reporting that a male has carried out an action towards a victim. But beyond that, I wouldn't want to elaborate because I can't read my own writing, I'm afraid.
The CIA reference?
So community impact assessment. For an incident of this significance and an incident that's been declared a critical incident, one of the key components of a critical incident management is to create and maintain a community impact assessment. So there is a formal templated document that exists in policing that is completed, and you'll see that I've then referenced the local CI is out, so that's the area commander, so Nikki Shepherd, who was by out I mean as in has come out and put herself on duty and has clearly been given the responsibility to start to develop that community impact assessment.
And then there's mention in the handwriting, if we can come up the page, 11 o'clock Gold Group question mark, and then Crown Office Perk-led inquiry.
Yeah.
9:55 appointed PIM. And that again is consistent with what you said in your PIM log.
Yeah.
And then the references thereafter.
So I think, and as I say, this is based on my assessment of this document 10 minutes ago, I think that those last 5 lines have been written later, because when I got to Kirkcaldy, if you remember when I arrived at Kirkcaldy, I spoke and was briefly spoke with the area commander, briefly spoke with Guy McEwen, and was being given very basic information. And that's when I became aware of the individuals that were involved. So Detective Superintendent Campbell is the SIO, so I've jotted that name down. It looks actually, I've used a different pen for that final bit of the document. Inspector Jane Coombe, as we know, is the PIM support officer. Amanda Given is the name of the Federation rep. Due to finish at 4 p.m. The officers were early shift, so that's me, I think, documenting what their duty time should have been. And then again, I think the final line, as in Jane FME, so that's Forensic Medical Examiner. I actually think that's probably, again, I've used that as a note later. So if you recall at the meet and greet, I reference medical, and the action was for Jane to take that forward. I think I've just jotted that down at that similar point. So this, I've referred in my previous statements about a PIM folder that I used to carry around for when if I was required to be a post-incident manager, that contained documentation, and it clearly contained some blank A4 paper as well. And I've just used that as a scribble pad, and then transferred that information into the PIM log when I was able to do so.
Thank you, that's great. Could we go back to the PIM log then, please? We can use the version that we had yesterday, or we can use this version, page 14. And I think we were moving on to 1530, which should be at the bottom of that page.
Yeah, I see that.
And it starts, discuss length of time of recovery clothing with Detective Superintendent. And then if we can move on to the top of page 15, Campbell stated he would speak with DCI Stuart Houston. And we mentioned DCI Stuart Houston yesterday.
That's right.
I'm interested in this entry, if we can maybe go back to 1530 at the bottom of the previous page. Discussing length of time of recovery of clothing. We've heard evidence that the officers had returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office from Hayfield Road early in the morning, roughly around 8 o'clock. You'd prepared officers with your meet and greet at 11:30. You'd mentioned clothing at that meet and greet. And then you've noted in the PIM log, and you spoke about this yesterday, that Pat Campbell had mentioned clothes in a bag when he spoke to officers at 13:41. What was the purpose of this discussion at 15:30 with Detective Superintendent Campbell?
So, again, just slightly further up at 1400, and we spoke about this yesterday, at 1400 I spoke to DCI Stuart Houston about the process we were going to undertake to recover the clothing. And at 15:30 that process had not started, and I was concerned that time was moving on. The officers had been on duty for now their full period of duty in normal terms, and from a welfare point of view, this is a process that, whilst we understand it needs to take place and how it's going to take place, we need to start the process so that the officers, we get through that process as promptly as we can do, so that the officers' welfare can be maintained. And actually, at this point, we should be thinking about them going off duty. not maintaining them on duty for an extended period of time. So that was the conversation. I expressed my concern about the length of time it was taking.
And was that something that the officers were feeding back to you, or just something that you prompted as PIM?
So both. So there was commentary from a couple of officers about the length of time that the process was taking, and my responsibility as the PIM to try and balance those two aspects.
And then if we move on to the next page, do we see that within around half an hour, about 1600, Craig Walker hands over his uniform, and then there's a series of entries in the log about officers handing over uniforms and going to see the doctor.
Yeah. So essentially that's the process that we had discussed at 2 o'clock. That's the process starting at 4 o'clock, and then it was a fairly, well, you see the length of time it took, still quite a lengthy process, but nevertheless there was an efficiency of the process going on then. So
the officers had been kept in the canteen, the PIM suite, for over 7 hours from their return to Kirkcaldy Police Office by that stage. Looking back now, what would you say about the length of time that they were kept there prior to getting their clothes, their uniforms taken?
So I think, as we discussed yesterday, post-incident processes do take time, and there's an acknowledgement of that, and indeed the meet and greet refers to that, sort of making sure the officers are aware of the time that these things are going to take. Equally, we need to balance that and be as efficient as we can be, and that's why I raised those concerns about the length of time it took.
Looking back now, do you think you should have pushed more in terms of making progress with that element of the procedure that day? I
think my responsibility is to raise their concerns, my concerns and the concerns of the officers to the SIO. It's the SIO and indeed the DCI who has delegated that task to put those activities in place as quickly as they can in order to facilitate that. So I think I carried out my role in terms of raising those concerns, and indeed, a short time after I raised those concerns, the process started. So.
We've heard evidence that in order to complete use of spray forms and use of force forms, that the officers would have required access to computers. We've also heard that there weren't any computers available in the canteen. Were you ever asked by any officers whether they could have access to computers to complete those forms?
No, I've no recollection of an officer asking for access to a computer.
If you had been asked, is that something you would have noted in the PIM log?
It is, and so I think there's a couple of issues there in terms of the complete. So if I'd been facilitating officers accessing another office with computers to carry out whatever piece of work, then I think that is absolutely something that would have been recorded there in the same way that other activity has been recorded. There probably would have been a conversation if that had come forward about what activity they were going to undertake and what they were going to document based on the legal advice that they've been given at that point in time.
If you had been asked to facilitate computers or access to computers to complete forms, is that something you would have been able to do in Kirkcaldy?
I think, as I said yesterday, I'm not familiar with the office layout at Kirkcaldy, so there will be an office with computers that the officers use during going about their day-to-day business. If that office was full of detectives, for example, I don't know, or perk investigators, so I can't really answer that question because the inquiry was never made, and therefore I never went and established if there was space or not. There may or there may not have been.
Is it generally part of PIM to facilitate access to computers, to allow officers the opportunity, should they wish to take it, of completing paperwork?
No, it's not. This is not part of the process that's in the SOP. There's no section headed access to computers for police paperwork, so it's not part of the PIM process. My experience of of post-incident management, well, throughout my time of being a post-incident manager, is that isn't something we do. That the important part is the process that we've discussed yesterday, the provision of accounts, and actually and we spoke yesterday about how there might be different options around the personal initial account, so that might be something that we would facilitate computer access for them to type a personal initial account. My experience had been, and it's probably because of the timescale, it had been more a written document, but both options are available. But beyond the personal initial account, that's normally one of the last things that takes place prior to the officers leaving the PIM suite and going off duty. So that being able to access a computer in order to carry out other business, if you like, is not part of the PIM process.
Okay. There was in the SOP we looked at yesterday, the PIP SOP, the procedure set out envisages the stage 4 statements, which were principal officer statements, but not that they would be done on the day. Here, the 3rd of May we're talking about. They would be given at least 48 hours to prepare those. Were Amanda Given and the principal officers aware of what was expected in terms of initial personal accounts? Did you make them aware that that was something that would be looked for prior to them going off duty?
So in the meet and greet, if we remember, we spoke about this yesterday. In the meet and greet, there's part of the meet and greet where you lay out the post-incident process, which includes the provision of accounts. And that's what I laid out at the beginning in that initial meet and greet.
Can we look at the aid memoir again, please? PS 18503. And if we can move down, please. Which part of the aid memoir indicates where you set out the 4 stages of PIP?
So just scroll down a little bit further. So at the end it talks about initial accounts. So that's why I spoke about the process.
Thank you.
As the process should be.
So it was a specific part of one of the bullet points was to explain about initial personal accounts, which would be stage 3 of the procedure. And I think you said yesterday that you did cover all the bullet points in the aid memoir.
That's right.
Thank you. Were there any questions about what an initial personal account was?
So no specific questions that I can recall, but as I said yesterday, what I tried to do with the post-incident procedure was not use the precise language of a firearms post-incident procedure that I knew these officers were not familiar with. So throughout my explanations to the officers, I tried to use language that I knew that they would understand. So if I used personal initial accounts or if I talked about initial statements, I can't say 100% at this point, 8 years on. What I can say is that I took the process and I tried to explain it to officers that have never been either briefed, trained, or experienced the post-incident procedure process. So there isn't a clinical interaction going on between me and the officers. There is a supportive, explanatory approach being taken by me so that the officers, particularly in the fact that they've just experienced that difficult situation, understand what I'm trying to say. So I imagine that I was talking about initial statements as much as personal initial accounts.
As part of your explanation, did you explain the distinction between what you were calling initial statements and what officers may have understood to be a typical operational statement?
Yeah, so I explained the fact that full statements would be provided in a couple of days' time.
And did you give an explanation that distinguished what an initial account or...
Not in any great detail.
Was it clear to the officers from your explanation that these initial accounts would be much briefer? And yesterday you talked about it being no more than a page of A4. Was that something you explained?
So the detail that we've discussed initial accounts is not the detail that I described them to the officers at the time. So I would have used the language around initial statements, initial accounts, and at that point in the meet and greet, I didn't go into any more detail. If the process had moved on as it is intended to, and we got to the stage of providing initial accounts, then the role of the PIM is to give that level of detail about what should be included in the initial personal account. That's not, you don't go into that level of detail in that initial briefing because there's a number of points that you cover. When you get to that stage in the process, and also they wouldn't remember. So when you get to that stage in the process, you would then give them more detail as we're discussing and as we discussed yesterday.
At what point, you've talked about them seeking legal advice. Would it not assist officers to have more of an explanation about what's being expected of them in terms of providing initial personal accounts, in order that they can discuss that with their lawyers and take advice about whether or not to give those initial personal accounts?
So, I mean, my assessment at the time was that they were obtaining legal advice from an experienced legal professional appointed by the Federation. And again, probably an assumption on my part that that individual would have knowledge of post-incident procedures. So I have, and we spoke about this yesterday in relation to my assumptions around people's knowledge about post-incident procedure to a certain extent. I made an assumption that the Federation appointed legal advisor would have an understanding of post-incident procedures, and therefore the advice that they were being given was relevant to post-incident procedures.
Right. And looking back now on that assumption, given the evidence you gave yesterday about many police officers not having an awareness about post-incident procedures, given the SOPs are not law, what do you think about that assumption now, looking back?
So I would tie it into the discussion we had yesterday about the maturity of all the stakeholders in post-incident procedure. So I would still assume that there was a level of knowledge there, but I can't say for definite, but I would assume that there was a level of knowledge there, even in 2015, because, well, I was trained in 2009, so 2015 it wasn't new, it was something that had been, around before I was trained. So even if you went from 2009, that's still a number of years before. So, so my reflections. So it links into the experience of all key stakeholders. Everyone now in 2023 is much more aware of post-incident procedures, and therefore the whole process works in a far more sophisticated, slick and efficient fashion than it did in 2015. In 2015, there was a level of knowledge of post-incident procedures, but it is clear, and it's clear through my lived experience of going through it, that level of knowledge was not what it is now and what it should be. So that's that continuous improvement side. If I could have done things different on the day, so I have roles and responsibilities around the delivery of the process and the procedure. I can't take that greater responsibility of educating everyone involved in the incident at the time of the incident. That's an impossible ask. So yes, it would have been far better if all the stakeholders knew far more about post-incident procedures, and the outcomes would have been different if that had been the case, but it wasn't the case. And so I did my best in the environment I was in and the level of knowledge that all the organisations and key stakeholders had around post-incident procedure.
And just to be clear, are you including the lawyers acting for SPF or for the individuals as key stakeholders?
I am.
Thank you. Can I ask you about some evidence that we heard from Amanda Given
I wonder, just before you do that, Ms. Graham, I wonder if I could just pick up on what you said about the opportunity to complete forms. Am I right in thinking that where a spray is discharged, there's a requirement to fill a form up?
So there are, indeed, sir. So there are use of force forms that are internal police forms. And if we looked at the SOP or certainly the custom and practice around use of force forms, it is usual in the business as usual sense. It is usual to complete those forms prior to finishing duty. So in a normal incident where CS had been discharged, officers, when they were back at the station, would complete both sort of criminal justice processes and those internal forms, such as the use of force form for discharging PAVA. That form isn't part of a criminal justice evidential procedure. It's part of an internal mechanism for monitoring the use of force by the organisation.
Can I just interrupt? Is there a statutory requirement to complete a form in respect of discharge of spray?
Not that I am aware of, sir. No, I think that is an internal SOP police procedure to complete that form. And typically it would be completed before that tour of duty, but equally in certain circumstances it could be completed the following day, for example, and that's still sufficient time to trigger the internal processes that form triggers. So use of force does get assessed by health and safety. So there will be requirements under health and safety legislation around our monitoring from a health and safety perspective, but that isn't as time critical as it needs to be done before the end of that duty. That can be picked up through the normal business processes the following working day, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've heard evidence about a memorandum that was issued which came into effect from the 1st of April 2013, which indicated that because a CS spray is a firearm in terms of the legislation, that it was a legal requirement of officers to complete a form if they had discharged their spray. Do you remember anything about that from 2013?
I don't remember that memo from 2013 now, I'm sorry.
So do you accept perhaps that you could be mistaken about whether or not there's a legal requirement to complete the CS spray discharge?
Absolutely. And if that has a timeline on it as well in relation to when it needs to be submitted, then obviously that's the memo that's been circulated.
As I understand it, there is a time requirement and it was to be sent to the training department email address and then it would be forwarded to PERC within, and my memory may be flawed, but it was within 48 hours, I think.
Right. So that's still a similar process that takes place today. So there is so in normal business, when PERC haven't been directed to lead an investigation, then PERC are notified through a reporting mechanism of every discharge. And so that's a normal business process, and if that's supported by a legal requirement, then I accept that that's the position. That's a normal business process. In the circumstances that we're in at the moment, PERC have been directed to make the full inquiry of the full circumstances, and so they have that, if you like, they have that notification that CS has been discharged because they've been briefed on that as part of the investigation. So the report doesn't trigger something additional because PERC are already engaged, would be my assessment of that.
Are you suggesting that because PERC are leading the investigation, that negates the necessity to complete a CS spray form, use of spray form? So there are other reasons for submitting the form. It's an internal, so it triggers, so PERC need to be notified, which is in line with the memo, and normally that's done as you've described. PERC are aware of the discharge of CS because they're now leading the investigation. There are also internal reasons, organisationally, health and safety, training department, in terms of how we use force and assessment of that.
is also triggered by the form. So the form should be submitted. What I'm suggesting is that the legal requirement to send that to PERC are already leading the inquiry and therefore know that the CS has been discharged, and that will be part of that inquiry.
So you're not suggesting that because PERC were leading the inquiry that there would be no requirement to complete the use of spray form, just that it may not require to be sent to PERC? Is that what you're suggesting?
So I need to just rewind slightly. So what I'm saying is that as the post-incident manager, it wasn't my responsibility to fill in that form. The officers did not have access to computers and therefore couldn't fill in the form. And my understanding in terms of the legal advice they'd been given was it wasn't appropriate for them to fill in that form, because essentially they're then giving an initial account of what's happened in the summary of that form. I recognise the legal requirement of notifying PERC in the timescale that you indicated, and PERC were obviously aware of the discharge as CS well within the timescale that you've indicated. There are also internal reasons why we would want that form submitted in due time in terms of the training, the wider impacts, and that can be done at an appropriate time in that timeline. So these are quite unique circumstances where we're discussing. So in business as usual, I fully accept this is an easy, straightforward process. In the circumstances we're facing on the 25th, it is complicated by a number of factors.
All right.
But just picking up on that, from my point of view, why can the PIM process not accommodate the completion of forms process?
So it doesn't accommodate it. It didn't accommodate it in 2015, and from recollection of how it's laid out today, it still doesn't necessarily accommodate the further administrative requirements. So once officers, now there are other avenues for the completion of that form. So, for example, it could be submitted on behalf of, so line management could submit the use of force form to comply with that timescale, but equally to allow the officers to focus on the other parts of the post-incident process. So my experience of the post-incident process is that the officers will come from the incident into that PIM suite, will go through the process, which might include the handing over of clothing. It's likely to include the provision of those personal initial accounts, and at that stage, in line with the process, at that stage, they're normally allowed to go home and come back in, and then the subsequent duties are arranged. So it's a focus around the priorities of the investigation and the priorities of their welfare, rather than completing all those other administrative tasks that in any case can probably be picked up either through line management or in the following day.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
We don't have the memo on the list for display today, but it does seem, for those listening, it's PS 11500. We've looked at this before, and it does appear to say from the 1st of April 2013 there is a legal requirement for the police service to ensure compliance with the provisions, and that on every occasion where CS incapacitant spray is discharged operationally, there is a legal requirement to record the incident and report onwards to PERC within 24 hours. So it may be that it's not simply letting PERC know that there is a legal requirement to record the incident, and the way and the means that that is recorded is through what's a form, a particular form that we've also heard evidence about. A form emailed to Officer Safety Training, CS spray discharge. So it would appear that there. Can I ask you another question? How were you aware that there was legal advice not to complete forms as opposed to provide statements?
So the discussion around forms that we're having did not take place on the day in question, did not take place in the PIM suite. So there was this level of discussion around the completion of forms did not take place.
So was the discussion and the discussion about legal advice exclusively in relation to providing statements?
Yes.
Can I ask you some questions about Amanda Given's evidence? I'll read out a passage and just ask you to comment on whether you agree with this evidence. So this is Amanda Given giving evidence on day 18 of the inquiry on the 14th of June last year. The advice that I gave to the officers was at some point someone who is investigating may come along and ask you for a statement. What you should be inquiring is what your status is. Am I a witness or am I a suspect? If you're a suspect, then you probably want to seek some legal advice before you do that, because they really shouldn't be asking you for a statement if you're a suspect. And if they confirm that you're a witness, then I suppose we never got to that part. But the next part might have been, are we doing that today? Is today the best day for that to be done, given what had gone earlier? But yes, it was as straightforward as that, of going, if you're asked for a statement, you should be asking, because they will not ask me for that. I wasn't there. You should be ascertaining whether you're a witness or a suspect. That was Amanda Given's evidence about the advice she gave to the officers in the canteen. Do you remember Amanda Given giving that advice to officers?
Not in that level of detail, no.
Having heard that passage of evidence, does that accord with your understanding of what Amanda Given told the officers?
So there's at least two aspects to that. So the first aspect is in relation to the suspects and witnesses bit. So we covered this yesterday. So in my view, as a post-incident manager, if someone had been identified to me as a suspect, then it's not appropriate for them to continue in the post-incident suite. So that's my position on it, and Amanda may have a different perspective on it, but that's my position on it. In relation to the access to legal advice, again, as I covered yesterday, because it's a Federation lawyer, it is typically the Federation representative who secures that legal advice. Either that can be face-to-face and or over the phone. On this occasion, my understanding was it was going to be over the phone, and the officers would leave the PIM suite, go into the corridor/room immediately adjacent, and receive that legal advice. I didn't interfere with that process, nor did I check what was actually happening when the officer left the room. And so any conversation that took place with the officer in that circumstance, I wasn't aware of. I was allowing them to receive their legal advice out with the hearing of both other officers and myself as the post-incident manager. So if Amanda is saying that that's what the officers were, either she told them or then that's what happened. I wasn't there at that particular point in time, so I can't confirm or deny that that's what was said.
Right. And you didn't check what was happening in the other room. Do you even know if they were speaking to lawyers? I say this because we didn't hear anything from Amanda Given in evidence that she had arranged for them to speak to lawyers and seek legal advice from the canteen.
So what I expected to be happening was that the officers were being taken from the PIM suite into that side room, and that there was access to the legal advice being provided. Because there wasn't an individual there, my assumption was it was taking place over the phone.
Right. But that was your understanding of what was happening?
That's right.
Not having heard that from Amanda Given, could you be mistaken that that occurred? You've not noted it in the PIM log? Or?
Absolutely. That is that's my belief of what was happening, but I didn't witness it happening, so indeed anything else could have happened.
Okay. Amanda Given also commented that the officers on the day did not have clarification of their status, whether they were witnesses or whether they were suspects. Can you comment on that?
So I can. I think I've. So when the notes I made around the SIO speaking to the officers.
Is this the PIM log?
Yeah, at 1341.
Page 1341.
Yeah,
So that is that page 14?
Page 14, 1341, when Detective Superintendent Pat Campbell spoke to the officers, one of the things that he said to them was that there was no suspicion on any of the officers.
And we see that on the screen now.
Yeah, and so for me, it was quite clear that they were witnesses, and indeed that aligns to the discussion we had around witnesses are rightly in the post-incident process, suspects aren't rightly in the post-incident process. And I think it was clear to me, and it was briefed to the officers. I would also understand if the officers, because of pressures that they were under and the impact of the incident on them, that may not have landed, that verbal briefing may not have landed and been computed by them. That's understandable in the circumstances they were in. But it was clear to me and to the SIO at the time.
Could we move on to return to the PIP SOP, please? PS 10934. And if we could, just before we begin looking at some details, you mentioned yesterday about the importance of you being independent from the SIO. And I think you made specific mention of that when we were going through the introductory parts. If the SIO says, as you've noted in your PIM log, that there's to be no statements, no operational statements taken, is there anything in the PIP SOP that says that in itself is to prevent any initial personal accounts being taken or detailed accounts in due course? Or
Sorry, could you just repeat the question?
You mentioned yesterday about the importance of you being independent. Yeah. So regardless of whether or not the SIO says, I don't want any statements for the investigation, yes, irrespective of that, does it not remain your obligation to continue with PIP procedures? So
yes, my responsibility is to put in place the post-incident procedure, which includes the obtaining of personal initial accounts. Now it's understood by both the investigation side and the post-incident management side what that looks like and entails. In 2015, I made some assumptions about the language that was being used and what was understood by that and what it entailed. If I could have continued, so there's two aspects of the personal initial accounts as we discussed yesterday. There's both the SIO opinion on it, if that was an opinion about personal initial accounts or operational statements, stage 4 accounts. So there was the view of the SIO around that, and there was also the legal advice not to provide a statement, which it clearly is in the procedure, around subject to medical and legal advice. So even if I discount everything that the SIO says to me, I'm then left with personal initial accounts subject to medical and legal advice, and the legal advice was not to provide a statement, a written account, and therefore it wouldn't have been appropriate to provide a personal initial account. Is it my role to try and obtain that? Yes, it's also my role to make sure that the process is followed, which includes the medical and legal advice. And we discussed some of that detail yesterday.
We did. And again, we talked about sort of not speaking the same language as Campbell. And you've again discussed his comments and his use of the word statements and operational statements, which you noted. And looking at the PIP SOP, talking about personal initial accounts and then the more detailed statements. At any point when, as you've noted in your PIM log, Campbell said no statements are required or no operational statements are required. Did you probe or question him in relation to whether he would still look for initial personal accounts? Because you wouldn't be expecting detailed statements that day anyway.
So as again we discussed yesterday, when I spoke to Detective Super Campbell, I had my PIM folder with me, which included the SOP, which included the initial account, the reference to initial accounts and detailed accounts. So when we were having that conversation about statements, I was referring to initial accounts and detailed accounts. Now, I can't recall the exact language that I had, how much we dug into it, not enough to get the clarity that we are seeking here today. So that is, and again, if we refer back to the lessons learned, this is the key lesson learned, is that the investigative side did not have the full appreciation of post-incident procedures. The wider organisation did not have the understanding of post-incident procedures, and I was trying to implement a procedure that I knew about and had been trained on and experienced on, and trying to do that in a live dynamic situation where there are lots of pressures and time pressures and et cetera on all the individuals involved. And therefore, yes, you can push into that space in terms of initial account, full account, but only within a very limited time frame of the other pressures of the individuals. But this is the key learning for this aspect. I absolutely accept that this would look so different now than it did in 2015. I fully acknowledge that learning has taken place, but it wasn't in place in 2015.
And does this go back to what you said earlier about you could not, in that environment, educate everybody about PIP?
And even the SIO, and reference to what a crucial, challenging role the SIO role is, and the short interactions I was able to have with him because of all the other pressures that he was under in terms of goal groups and PERC and briefing detectives and so on. So yeah, it's a very time-pressured environment, and therefore you make assumptions about the level of knowledge that people have around different bits of the procedure.
Can I ask you to look at paragraph section 8.15, 8.15 of the SOP? And this is a section which says the basic facts should be confirmed with the person providing them to certify accuracy and be timed and dated by the PIM. The original should be handed to the IIO, whilst the PIM and the person providing should retain a copy. And you explained yesterday that the IIO is the same as the SIO and it would be Campbell that day. Just pausing for a moment and thinking about that aspect, is that an obligation on you as PIM to obtain the basic facts and provide them and certify them for accuracy?
Yes, that's the role and responsibility of the post-incident manager.
And then that the original should be handed to, effectively, the IIO by you.
Yes.
So when you arrived at Kirkcaldy Police Office, you've described to us arriving at 11 and the first meet and greet at past. Why did you not seek out the SIO Campbell until he came to meet you at the PIM suite at 13:40?
So I was taking other parts of the PIM process. I was conducting other parts of the PIM process, and the natural place to speak to the SIO is after I've initiated the post-incident process. Could it have been sooner? Probably. Was he also very busy in other aspects of his duties? Yes. Was I also busy with the meet and greet and some of the smaller sort of intermediary stuff that was going on? Yes. And therefore, the first opportunity we had to get together was at the time we did.
And did you hand a document to Campbell at some point which contained the basic facts?
No. So we spoke about the basic facts yesterday, and my decision as a post-incident manager, there was no need to provide basic facts because the information that we had at the time, and indeed now seeing the handwritten notes I made at 9:30 in the morning, if I'd written that in full sentences, that covers the sort of levels of information that are contained within PIM basic facts. And for me to have written that, signed and dated it, several hours later, when that information was widely known to the management and the investigation at that point, as I said yesterday, in my view, we were beyond PIM basic facts. There was a greater level of knowledge than would have been achieved by PIM basic facts, and therefore I didn't carry out that particular part of the process.
And again, we touched on this yesterday in relation to accuracy. Looking back now, what ways could you, as PIM, have certified accuracy of the basic facts, as it says in 815?
Yeah. So we shouldn't read that paragraph in isolation of the other bits of this SOP. So we spoke yesterday about the best way to obtain basic facts, or the preferred way, is not to obtain it from the principal officers, the officers that have been directly involved. The SOP in front of us references the OFC, but we spoke yesterday about that. In this situation will probably be the sergeant. And in my experience of other post-incident procedures, it's the first line manager that often would sit with the post-incident manager and just go through those basic facts. So if we speculate that I had done it, that is a likely course of action I would have taken. And therefore we would have, so the certified as factual accuracy is about, so that's not me checking that the individuals are what they're telling me. That's because I'm not part of the investigation. That's the investigation's responsibility to, again, as we spoke about yesterday, the further the investigation goes, the more accurate the knowledge of what happened at the incident is. So I would have obtained that information from either the sergeant or another person who was there who was deemed to be more appropriate, and it would have been, their, and again, it's not their individual account of what's happened, it's a summary of what's happened, and we would have agreed that as, is that what happened? Yes, that's what happened. Actually, I would have verbalised that with the officers. Is that what happened? Yes, that's what happened. Signed, date.
And assuming that had been done, does that assume that the sergeant would have accurate information also?
So therein lies so PIM basic facts. So the purpose of PIM basic facts is to initiate the investigation stage. So this is an incident has happened. SITREP reports have gone through radio systems and verbal briefings, so we know from a SITREP position what has happened, but there's a crucial missing piece that means the investigation cannot initiate. So PIM basic facts would cover that detail off. We have that detail in the initial briefing that I was given. So it's not, the PIM basic facts is to allow the IIO, the SIO, to initiate their investigative approach. That investigative approach was well and truly initiated and underway. And so the purpose of PIM basic facts is not applicable in the incident that we were facing. And that's why I didn't spend that time and focus on completing them, because it wasn't necessary in the circumstances.
So by the time you became involved as PIM, we may hear evidence, and we have heard some evidence from Robson, that the basic facts, if I can call that in a non-specific way, had been shared already with Campbell at that point.
And that, without me knowing that kind of illustrates the point I'm trying to make, is that so this event took place on a public street with witnesses, with CCTV, with officers that had already briefed in what they'd done. If the reason we have PIN basic facts is that if a firearms incident, if the only people that are there are firearms officers, I mean, it doesn't need to be firearms, but if the only officers are there, firearms officers in isolation, so maybe inside a building, for example, and there is no one that can tell us what happened other than those officers that were there, so therefore the investigation cannot start because it doesn't know where to start, then PIN basic facts would trigger that and allow that to happen. We knew that. And the investigation was actually in ramping up and in full flow in terms of the activities that needed to take place.
And that was in flow by the time you arrived at Kirkcaldy at 11 o'clock?
Absolutely. I don't want to confuse things, but it is worth pointing out that Appendix N, about the provision accounts, the legal advice is applicable to Stage 2 PIN basic facts, as well as Stage 3 and Stage 4. So whilst that wasn't a consideration on the day, and it didn't influence my decision around it, it is worth the inquiry being aware that the SOP does, that stages 2, 3 and 4 are all subject to legal advice. So that potentially could have created issues if indeed we'd needed to and I had gone down that path. But I say I don't want to complicate it because that isn't where we were, but it is worth knowing that in the fullness of the SOP, that's what it says.
I think we did look at Appendix N yesterday.
Yes, we did, yeah.
Maybe we could go back to that just briefly. I think the section you're referring to was in the introductory paragraphs of Appendix N. I don't have a note of the number. We'll just have to go down.
It's page 34.
Right, thank you very much.
And it's the second sentence down. It says, providing stages 2 to 4, brackets inclusive.
Officers should be in a position to obtain legal or medical advice prior to providing 2, 3 or 4. And basic facts are stages 2.
That's right.
Thank you. Can I ask if we could look at section 14, please, which is up the page. And in particular 14.5, drug and alcohol testing and forensic elimination samples, DNA. And if we can look at 14.5, 2 and 3, if we could have those on the screen. It talks there about the rationale for considering taking DNA samples from principal officers in order to obtain elimination samples. It said that will be considered on a case-by-case basis. An incident may reveal that fibre transfer or footwear marks, etc., are crucial to the investigation and will help to provide a truthful and accurate account of what happened. All requests should be relevant, borne out of sound rationale, documented, and subject to legal advice where appropriate. We have heard evidence that there weren't DNA samples taken from the officers. There were some taken from witnesses. And we've also heard that there's never any need to take DNA from officers because it's all on a database. Could you explain why this particular SOP talks about a scenario where DNA samples are taken possibly from officers, if that's never necessary?
I can't really provide a good explanation for that.
Right.
To be honest, that's in this SOP, and I think that will also be in the authorised professional practice on policing. But obviously you've heard evidence that all of our DNA is stored, so that would negate the purpose of that, unless there's some other investigatory reason that it would be more appropriate for an SIO to, you might get a better answer from an investigator professional as opposed to myself.
Was there any discussion with you about facilitating taking samples from officers?
There wasn't.
Thank you. And can I ask you to look at section 3.4 finally? I think we did talk about section 3 yesterday, but one of the things I didn't ask you was, so 3.4, you talk about, sorry, an early decision should be made on which officers will be considered principal officers. We spoke about that yesterday and about Davidson and Connell not being included by the PIM in conjunction with the strategic PIP commander, the TFC and the IIO. Now, you talked about TFC yesterday and the IIO. What about the strategic PIP commander? Who would that be?
So that would be, in this circumstance, ACC Nicholson would be fulfilling that role.
Okay, thank you. Can we move back to your PIM log, please? And that's PS 00387. And I'm interested in moving on to Monday the 4th of May, which is page 17 of the log. And you will see here that you are describing a telephone call at 11:15 in the morning.
That's right.
So you remained PIM the following day. And you say, telephone call for update, Chief Inspector Nicola Shepherd, Area Command, phoning. And then could you read the rest of that, please?
So that says, phoning round officers at moment for welfare check to see the plans for the day.
And then ACC decision
Yeah.
not operational for the
So-
remainder of the week, so the officers were not to effectively come back to duties.
Yeah, not to come back to normal duties to to staff up a patrol car and so on. They may well be back on duty, but for the purposes of any post-incident sort of management.
And then in the last entry there it says no contact today from PERC. So again, did you have no contact from PERC on the 4th of May?
That's right.
It's written after the 11:15 telephone call. Can you explain what that meant? No contact from PERC?
So so as I read that, I'm not sure if that's me writing that, but it looks to me like that's actually part of the update with Nicola Shepherd, that there's been no contact from PERC.
All right,
So I'm not sure if she's verbalised that rather than that's me just verbalising it in terms of PERC haven't contacted me today.
All right. And then 1300. Discussion with Superintendent Mackenzie regarding provision of statements. Was that still being discussed the following day?
Yeah, so the role of the post-incident manager, as we know from the SOP, is to continue right through to those stage 4 accounts, which should be done after the 48-hour period. So that's why I'm still engaging with them to try and get updates in relation to the officers. Now, some of the more the welfare side was really, in fact, both sides. So. The welfare side was primarily starting to be driven by the line management, and we discussed earlier this morning about the welfare strategy and so on, and what was being put in place from a welfare point of view. The discussion around the provision of the detailed statements, the stage 4 accounts, and that discussion was almost, I'm going to say being taken away from me. That sounds like it was an active thing, but was happening elsewhere. So the investigation side, as in the police investigation side and PERC, they were obviously engaged in those discussions, and the Police Federation were also taking a role in engaging with the investigation side around those discussions. So the role of PIM, as it's documented in the SOP, was kind of being circumvent, again, doesn't sound like the right word, but there's another process that was being put in place. So those discussions were happening directly and out with me being part of those discussions. And so when actually the next couple of days of updates, it's generally me actually obtaining an update from people about where we are with that, in an effort to, well, A, be helpful, and B, be part of it in line with the post-incident process. the responsibility for provision of that statement moved away from me over the next couple of days and became a conversation with the investigation side and the Federation on behalf of the officers, and so that was out with my direct involvement.
Did you have any direct involvement in the discussions going on between the SPF and the investigative side?
No, so the sort of 1300 update there is one of the, I suppose, is a direct conversation that I was involved in there, as you can see from my note. But there's no further notes on this day, and as the log goes on, it's then me really obtaining updates on where that is, as opposed to any direct conversations I'm having either with the investigation side or the Federation.
I'd like to move on to the next few lines, and it starts with advise officers on cause of death ? Now, it's just if we can move up the page slightly. Yes, just it looks like there's 2 entries for 13, but it might be 1500, is it?
Yeah, I think that second one is 15. That's my writing, I'm
1500.
afraid.
And it says there, advise officers on cause of death ? Update from Nikki Shepherd discussion. And then we move on to Tuesday the 5th of May.
Yeah.
But thinking just first of all about Monday the 4th of May and this discussion about advising officers about cause of death. Now, I think you were asked about this in your inquiry statement.
Yes, I was. Yeah.
So events occurred between the 4th and 5th of May. And for your own benefit, this is dealt with the paragraphs 254 to 256 of your inquiry statement. But I think for the moment we'll just stick with the PIM log on the screen.
Sure.
But you have your inquiry statement in front of you. So it's 254 to 256. I'm interested in this question. Sorry, have you got it?
Yeah, I've got 254. Thank you.
I'm interested in this question that you put in your log about advising officers on cause of death. Can you briefly explain to the Chair what was happening at that time?
So, certainly, and I think the update from Nikki Shepherd is relevant in the sense that this is a second conversation that I'm having with.
Let's look
with
at that
Nikki.
as well then. It's Tuesday the 5th of May. It's at the bottom of page 17.
No, sorry, just that the 1500. The
Oh, no,
1500 one. With,
yes.
So that what I've said, advise officers on cause of death ? I put in brackets after that update from Nikki Shepherd. So Nikki and I we've spoken in the morning, and this is us speaking again in the afternoon. So again, I've not necessarily been directly involved in this, but the discussion was that, as we understood it, the legal advice was to not provide a statement because we can't confirm what your status is. We won't be able to confirm your status until the cause of death is known. Hence the importance of the cause of death in relation to, from a post-incident point of view, that would be a trigger for the legal advice and the officers there to provide a statement. That's the kind of linkage between those bits of the jigsaw.
So the officers wanted to know what cause of death was, and then the legal advice would be once they know what cause, depending on the outcome of that, the status could be confirmed, the officers could have more confidence, and there would be a move in terms of being willing to provide statements.
So that is, as I understand it, so this is now not my direct, I'm not directly involved in these conversations with the officers, and I'm not directly involved in these conversations with the investigation team. So this is...
So who told you
This is my discussion with Nikki Shepherd as the area commander, so I'm assuming she was getting an investigative feed into that in line with her line management role.
So it was Nikki Shepherd who shared that information with you on the
Yes.
phone? Right. And Then we come on to Tuesday, the 5th of May. It says 2 voicemails left for Nikki Shepherd for update. Spoke with Jane Coombe, and then it's brackets AM PM.
So morning and afternoon.
She updated me that cause of death was, and if we can move on to page 18, advised last night, pending toxicology, and did not result from blunt trauma. Officers had been told last night, told Jane I would be in Kirkcaldy the following day as required. So we've heard evidence that the post-mortem took place on the 4th of May. That would be the Monday.
Okay.
And this appears to suggest that you were told that the officers had been advised last night, so that would be Tuesday the 5th of May, your entry in your PIM log. So they would be told on Monday the 4th of May, pending toxicology and did not result from blunt trauma. So the post-mortem takes place on the Monday,
Yeah.
4th of May. The officers are told that night what the cause of death was. And you were then advised on Tuesday the 5th of May by Jane Coombe
Yep.
or Nikki Shepherd.
Jane, I think.
Jane. Can you explain what involvement you had as PIM in relation to this discussion about whether or not to tell the officers about cause of death?
Yeah. I had no part in that discussion.
And was the first you heard of it when you had that conversation with Jane Coombe on Tuesday the 5th of May?
So there was the discussion in the Monday afternoon around, so it's advise officers on cause of death ? And discussion. So there's obviously a conversation between myself and Nikki about that. But we're not the decision maker in terms of the officers being advised about the cause of death. And then the following morning, I'm then receiving the update that someone has made that decision, and indeed the officers have been told.
What did you say to Nikki Shepherd during your discussion with her on the 4th of May about telling police officers about the cause of death?
I don't recall the detail of the discussion. What I'm aware of, and therefore what the likely discussion was around the legal advice, the relation the legal advice had to the cause of death, status of the officers, and in turn that linkage to the provision of statements. So that would have been the level of discussion that would have taken place.
Were you asked about your opinion on telling officers about the cause of death?
So this is a conversation between 2 chief inspectors and the police, so we would have had a discussion about the pros and cons of doing that.
What was your input? What was your view? What was your view about the pros and cons?
I could understand why that might assist the provision of statements.
By removing the hurdle?
Indeed.
What would the cons be?
Well, because at this point I didn't know what the cause of death was. So of course, if the cause of death was different and the officer's status changed, then you're in a different position.
But we're talking about the benefits of telling them would be that maybe perhaps that would aid the obtaining of statements, which would assist the investigation. Potentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
What would the disadvantages of telling the officers about the cause of death be? You've talked about the advantage of getting statements, which you've not got then, the investigation would like.
Yeah.
What are the disadvantages? That was part of the discussion.
So I don't recall us discussing disadvantages of that.
Can you think of any now?
Not really.
Were you concerned at all about the impact on the officers' accounts, knowing what the cause of death was?
That wasn't part of the discussion.
You do remember the discussion then?
So
I thought you said you didn't remember the discussion.
So I remember that we didn't talk in that detail about the pros and cons.
Right.
So because this isn't a discussion that's leading to a decision, this is two chief inspectors who are involved on the periphery of this, having a conversation about where we are with it.
Whose decision would this have been, as far as you'd remember?
I don't know who made the decision. I wasn't involved in the discussion or the decision.
How common is it in your experience to tell witnesses about the cause of death?
Police witnesses.
Witnesses?
So police witnesses involved in a death inquiry would normally know the cause of death.
Not before the post-mortem? Or are you saying they would know before the post-mortem?
No, sorry,
So how would the police witnesses normally know the cause of death after the post-mortem?
police witnesses that have been involved in the incident would know the cause of death as by part of that investigation. These circumstances and what normally happens are not very comparable, in my opinion.
Right.
We're in quite a unique set of circumstances here.
So in the circumstances here where the police have been involved in a restraint where the man died, in your experience, would the investigation side normally share the cause of death with those officers?
I don't think I'm the best person to help with this. I think
Right.
that the people that have been involved in the discussion, were involved in the investigation and made the decisions, should answer that question. I wasn't part of any of those pieces of the discussion.
All right.
In terms of my experience, since this incident, as I said yesterday as well, is that actually because of that maturity around organisations, the provision of personal initial accounts and the subsequent provision of detailed accounts 48 hours later is the normal situation that we find ourselves in as an organisation. So that process, that post-incident process, as per the SOP, based on receiving legal advice that, yes, continue to provide your personal initial account and your stage 4 account, that is normally what happens in post-incident procedures in 2023. So my experience since this incident is that we haven't been faced with these challenging circumstances since, in my lived experience. It might have happened elsewhere. And beforehand, my experience in terms of post-incident management was that we did provide detailed accounts in line with the SOP. So my experiences both before and after this incident were that the provision of accounts was there. Hence why I'm saying this felt a very unique set of circumstances in relation to trying to go through a process, but quite rightly, part of the process is that legal advice, and the legal advice caused problems with that process being followed through.
So in terms of your own personal experience, is this the only situation you've been in your career where officers have declined to give accounts, initial personal accounts or operational statements or whatever you want to call them? They've declined to give those on the basis of legal advice, but they have then been provided with information about the cause of death after the post-mortem.
I don't have a recollection of another set of circumstances that aligns itself to what you've just described.
So your personal experience is that has not happened in any other situation that you've personally been involved?
In my personal experience, it may well have, that I'm not aware of.
All right, thank you. And you're not sure who the decision maker would be. Have you any views on what the rank of officer would be that would be involved in making a decision like this?
My understanding is that the investigative side of this incident were involved in that discussion and decision making, including PERC. I don't know who or at what time or made that decision.
And when you say the investigative side, we've been talking about Pat Campbell as the SIO. Is that the sort of side that you're talking about?
So I wouldn't want to personalise it to Pat Campbell, because I know that at some point I'm not sure if it was on the Monday, but at some point he handed over his SIO responsibilities to PERC. So, and I can't remember if that is on the Monday or beyond, and that's based on my knowledge of the inquiry, not based on my knowledge at the time. But I'm aware that there was a handover between the SIO and the PERC. So
we've not heard evidence
No,
yet
I
from
appreciate
Campbell.
that,
We've
so-
not heard evidence yet from officers from PERC.
so they will be far
We'll
better
hear
placed
more
to answer
evidence
that.
about this. But that would be the side of
Yes.
things that would be
Yes.
involved in making that decision. Right. And you've noted that in your log that the cause of death was pending toxicology and did not result from blunt trauma. I'm interested in whether you have any recollection about why you noted it did not involve blunt trauma or blunt force trauma.
That was the terminology that was used from Jane to myself.
Why was it particularly noted that it wasn't because of blunt trauma? Was that something relevant to your role as PIM?
It's not relevant to my role as PIM.
Right. So why was it noted that it wasn't blunt
I
trauma?
think that's a question for the investigation side as well.
Right.
But because it's in line with the, so I'm aware that a form of words were created by the investigation side in relation to this provision of cause of death. That's evidence, as you say, that you've yet to hear, but that is within the evidence packs that are provided to the inquiry. So
We've heard evidence from PC Tomlinson that he struck Mr. Bio over the head on a number of occasions and body with his baton, and that when he returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office he was upset and concerned about the impact of that. And we've heard other evidence about red zones and effectively the potential danger of striking somebody to the head area. It can cause death. And that was something that PC Tomlinson gave evidence about last year in May. And I wondered if, noting in particular that it wasn't blunt force trauma, had something to do with, from a welfare perspective, with maybe sharing with PC Tomlinson he hadn't been to blame, which was causing him upset. Do you remember anything about that at all?
that's not part of my discussion or decision making.
And nobody mentioned that as a possibility to you? Like Jane
No.
Coombe never mentioned anything about Tomlinson in particular?
No.
And presumably if the cause of death had been something along the lines of a cardiopulmonary arrest due to restraint and struggle against restraint, or positional asphyxia or something along those lines, would that have had an impact on your role as PIM in relation to either the officers moving into the position of suspect or from a welfare perspective?
So it would have an impact. As I said, in terms of, I wasn't involved directly with these discussions at the time, and so I wasn't directly involved. So based on what you're saying, if the status of the officer changes, so that again is an SIO investigative side. If the cause of death indicates a change of status of an officer or a number of officers, then there's a change of status, and therefore they wouldn't be providing detailed accounts because they then become a suspect in the inquiry and criminal justice processes kick in.
And
that
removed out of the post-incident procedure process.
Yeah, I remember we're now talking 2 days after, so they're not physically anywhere. They're at home and or on duty in Kirkcaldy. So we're now talking just about the management of those officers in terms of their status in relation to the inquiry. But in general terms, if the cause of death was as you are indicating, then clearly the investigation side need to consider the status of the officers at that point and make appropriate decisions around that, which again is an SIO-led decision. Well, I say SIO and or at this point, it may well be PERC senior investigator decision. I'm not aware of that timeline.
And one last question about this, because I'm conscious of the time. Was any part of this discussion that you had with Jane Coombe about the reputation of the police service in light of the events at Hayfield
No.
Road?
No.
Okay. I'll come back to the rest later. I'm conscious it's
We'll take a 20-minute break at this point. That's great.
Thank you. You've talked to us about the conversation you had about cause of death and your understanding that the officers wanted to know about that before considering giving statements. After the officers had been told about cause of death on the 4th of May, do you know why they didn't give statements until the 4th of June? We've heard evidence that they gave statements to PERC on the 4th of June.
Yeah.
And we'll hear no doubt further evidence about that and the
Yeah.
requests that had been made by PERC during that period. But do you know why that removing the hurdle, you know, the
Yeah.
lack of information about cause of death didn't actually result in statements being delivered within that 7-day period, for example?
No, I'm afraid I don't know why
You don't
it
know.
took so long after for that position to change.
Okay. And do you know, was it part of any discussion that you had about whether the family were told about cause of death on the 4th of May?
I don't know if they were told or not on that date.
We may have heard evidence that they didn't discover that the post-mortem had taken place and been carried out until the 5th of May,
Right.
which would be the morning, as I understand it, on the
Tuesday.
yes, after or during a meeting with their solicitor. Were you aware of any discussions going on at the time about telling the family about the cause of death?
No, that's a investigative discussion decision.
And that wouldn't come to you as part of your role of PIM?
PIM, no, that's on the investigation side of the incident.
Could I go back to your PIM log, please, and just complete our consideration of what you noted? I think we're looking at the 5th of May now. So if we turn to page 18, this continues your involvement that day. And you've talked about the phone call with Nikki Shepherd at 1945 with the results of cause of death. We've talked about that. If you could go on further down the page. And then it says, Amanda Given has arranged FAI briefing for tomorrow afternoon. Agreed to call Kirkcaldy tomorrow, agreed to attend Kirkcaldy tomorrow to plan personal welfare strategies for each individual. First of all, what's an FAI briefing?
So FAI, Fatal Accident Inquiry. My recollection, understanding was that the officers were going to receive a briefing from the Federation lawyer around FAIs and the process and what their part in that process might be.
And that had been arranged by Amanda Given for the afternoon, the next day. So that would be the 6th of
That's the
May.
6th.
And then you mentioned earlier in your evidence this morning about the personal welfare strategy, and we talked about the document that we'd noticed at the end. Is that the point at which you are planning personal welfare strategies? Thank you. Then moving on to the 6th of May. It says welfare strategy meeting, Alan Seath, Amanda Given, an agenda trim, and then there's the redactions. Is that what you were talking about earlier this morning as well? That you then had I think you called it a handover with Alan Seath?
Yeah, so I wanted to go through that strategy and the points in that strategy with them and for them to then carry out that action with the officers and that would be part of the handover. But we also spoke to the officers as we'll come to.
Right. And then there's mention of media can't control, and if we move on to page 19, what does that?
The
word
top
say?
line.
Yes.
So diary. Write your recollection. Keep a diary ongoing. So this was advice to the officers to record, notwithstanding the discussion around provision of statements, that they themselves should record their recollection so that they have that, as I've done with my log, that is the recollection, that's it recorded. So that was advice to the officers.
We've heard from, I think, definitely one, perhaps two officers, that when they went to give their statements to PERC on the 4th of June or thereabouts, they produced a document they'd prepared. Is that the type of thing that you were talking about there?
It could well have been. And they may have received similar advice at that FAI briefing as well. I'm not aware of that.
And then does it say, in relation to FAIs, that they would be perhaps called as witnesses at some point in the future?
This is just the point about the timescales involved can be long, and therefore, recollection can fade.
Right. And then carrying on, keep going. You've continued to be involved, even though you've talked about handover to Alan Seath, but we see entries there 12, 1245, 1300s, 1400s. Can you explain to the chair why, although you'd had that handover with Alan Seath, there appear to be continuing entries in your log?
So I'm still, so I was in Kirkcaldy the whole day. So there wasn't this isn't about me sort of at 9 o'clock in the morning saying, here you go, it's on you now. I was there all day to both develop that strategy, talk to the officers, make sure Alan knew what he was going to do going forward. So it's not a time date handover. It's a process of me and my role and my knowledge and transferring and working with Alan, because he also would have had ideas that fed into that, and working together to make that handover happen. So it's a whole day spent in Kirkcaldy to develop these things.
And again, at 1300 hours, do we see reference to the template for individual welfare plan prepared? And again, was that something you mentioned this morning?
Yeah, so that was the document set we touched on this morning.
Thank you. And then if we can move down the page, please, on the screen. And it's 1725, there's mention of you emailing Keith Hardy, and it re-contact with PERC. From PERC, sorry, restatements to come through PIM. Can you tell us what that was in connection with?
So Keith was the name that had been given to me as the point of contact for PERC. So it had moved away from Pat Campbell at this point, and I've been given the name of Keith Hardy as a DCI. And I, at this point, in line with the process, I still felt I had a role to play in terms of that provision of the detailed accounts in line with the SOP. But no one from the investigative team was proactively approaching me to facilitate that. So this is another example of, I suppose, me trying to inject myself in the process as I thought right. So I've emailed Keith to say, look, statements should, that provision of statements should come through the post-incident manager in line with the SOP.
Right. So that was you acting in line with the SOP?
That was.
And you mentioned Keith Hardy and a contact from PERC. We may hear from Keith Hardy that he was from the MIT, as people have called it, the Major Incident Team,
yeah, okay.
who may have been supporting PERC
Right,
in
okay.
leading the investigation. Can we look at Thursday, the 7th of May, 10:50? You talk about a discussion with Alan Seath, Keith Hardy, restatements from officers. Legal advice has been to wait until cause of death after toxicology, compel, in quotation marks, officer to provide statement, difficulty if status, officer could change from legal advice. So can we go back to the start of that? Thank you. Could you explain to the chair what this entry connects with and what the discussion was?
Yeah, so I can't recall if this was a teleconference between the three of us. It indicates that to me in terms of the entry I've put, that it's a three-way conversation, but I don't recall that specifically. But that's certainly what I'm interpreting my entry to mean there, that there was it must have been a teleconference for the three of us to be there.
Can I ask you, just pause
Sorry.
there, can you look at the next page, page
Okay,
20
sorry.
at 12:36?
Yeah.
And there is particular mention there of telecon with DCI Keith Hardy Perk.
Yeah.
Looking at that subsequent entry, could it be that the subsequent one was a telecon?
So I don't think either would have been face to face. Sorry if that's what you're suggesting. I think they will both have been over the phone. So I was in Kirkcaldy on the day before, but the Thursday I think I would have been working in my usual office. So I think that these are both telephone calls. I'm surmising that because I've written two names, I'm surmising that's a three-way conversation as opposed to a one-to-one.
All right, sorry, I interrupted you. We were looking at the earlier entry on page 19, which started at 10:50 hours.
So I'm still recording the legal advice position that we've spoken about. So sorry, actually, no, that's now a change, isn't it?
This
So
is
what
after
this now,
the cause
yeah,
of death
so
has
this
been-
is now saying, so we must have had an update saying that, and this actually explains the further delay, sorry, this explains the further delay in the sense that toxicology obviously takes a number of days to come through, I think typically 10 days. And if the advice to the officers is now to wait until after toxicology, then that might indicate that delay. So that's being fed into the discussion there, that's going to invoke a further delay. And then there's this issue around, which we all started to touch on, I think, yesterday, about compelling officers to provide statements, and is that something that we can do as an organisation or not? And that difficulty around their status and their rights in terms of sort of self-incrimination and so on. So I think that's a reference to some of the, I suppose, the tricky issues around this whole situation we found ourselves in.
So first of all, in relation to toxicology, did you have any knowledge of what ongoing concerns the officers had regarding the outcome of toxicology results?
No, I didn't have that detail. So my level of detail is around the legal advice. Having, the legal advice is still to wait until after that point, so I don't have any more detail around that.
And when we're talking about compelling officers to provide statements, were you were obviously party to this discussion.
Yeah.
What comments were you making about the possibility of compelling officers to provide statements?
I think it's a really difficult position to be in, so from an organisational point of view, then we can, officers can be on duty and can be asked to provide an operational statement. The level of detail in that statement is a matter for them to document. So whilst you might be able to compel an officer to provide a statement, you can't compel the level of detail. That would be the individual's choice in terms of level of detail they were going to be put in there. So in a way, the compelling the officer could be seen as self-defeating in terms of the purpose of this is to actually elicit the full account of what has taken place. And so that was the kind of discussion. Whilst we might, organisation, be able to do it, what would the benefit / net result be of that? In terms of the circumstance we found ourselves, which is around the legal advice the officers now had in terms of toxicology. So that's the kind of discussion that was ongoing at that level.
And the word here that's used, or words, is statements and statement. Have you moved beyond the idea of initial personal accounts at this stage?
Yeah, so we're now talking about stage 4 detailed, because they've now had 2 periods of rest. So the whole focus now is on detailed, detailed accounts, detailed statements.
Thank you.
And actually, if we reference back to the SOP, it does reference if, for reasons you can't obtain initial accounts on the day, then you wait the 2 rest periods for the detailed account, which is ultimately what we want, because that's the full.
And can we move on to page 20, 12:36 hours? This is the discussion with Keith Hardy. Can you tell us what this says?
So this relates to, and we did touch on this yesterday in terms of my role on the day. So this is the bit about, yes, the officers are receiving that advice, but have we actually asked them to provide a statement in that one-to-one? I think it was the chair actually mentioned the say, can we sit down with them one-to-one and say, recognising the legal advice you've had, will you provide us a statement? So the decision from the view of the investigation side that I was aware of through the conversation with DCI Keith Hardy is that they wanted to do that. So at this point we hadn't done that, and they wanted to actually say to the officers, sit them down and say, will you provide us with a statement, and then obviously take their answer and take it from there, sort of thing. So that was that conversation. Hence the detail afterwards, about the 5 officers who are able to would attend work at 1300. And you see DCI will request statement with the inspector, Alan Seath, and Amanda in support, and just noting that they've received the legal advice.
And we've heard evidence that at some point during the course of that week, the week after the events, that officers were called in for a meeting with MIT, officers from MIT, who we will hear, Keith Hardy was one of them.
Right.
And during that meeting, they were asked for statements. Yeah. Was there any notice given to the officers before this meeting, as far as you know, that they were going to be asked for statements at that meeting?
Not that I'm aware of. So my interpretation of my notes is that the officers were coming on duty at 1 o'clock in any case. So that's the time that they've been asked to come on duty, those that are fit to attend work. And based on the discussions that morning, and obviously the perk position that I've documented there, that was going to happen. So obviously the DCI, so both Alan Seath is aware of this and Amanda Given is also aware of this. So if there was communication to the officers in advance of them attending work, bear in mind that's 12:36, so the officers may well be travelling to work at that point. So my suspicion is, based on my notes, is that they probably were made aware of that was going to happen when they attended for duty.
And looking back now, through the lens of a post-incident manager, and considering the welfare of the officers, do you think that giving them notice that they're going to be asked for statements by officers from MIT would have benefited them from a welfare perspective?
That probably would have been a better approach. But based on the circumstances at the time, the discussions, the unique situation we were facing, that isn't how it materialised. And as I say, in terms of post-incident procedures that have happened subsequently, the principle of coming back in 2 days later and providing a full statement is well understood and documented and so on. So the challenges that we were facing here are not challenges that, in my experience, we've had to face in subsequent post-incident procedures.
And I see that present at that meeting, the plan was that Alan would be there and Amanda, so Alan Seath and Amanda Given. Were you to be at that meeting?
No, so not at that point.
And were the officers to be invited to bring their lawyer along?
No.
No. And again, from a welfare perspective, knowing as you did that the legal advice at that time was to wait further, pending toxicology, no notice given, do you think in hindsight that perhaps they should have been invited to bring a lawyer along?
So the legal aspects, from my recollection and the notes, the legal aspects were being well covered through the Federation. How they were engaging, so we've already referenced the meeting with the Federation lawyer, which will have been on the day before, will it? The afternoon of the day before, the Wednesday. So, yeah. So they've had, they're represented, they've had interactions with the lawyer and they're represented by the lawyer. The detail of how that worked out was not something that I was involved in. In a gold standard response, yes, giving people notice, allowing them to bring legal representation in order to complete that stage 4 count, of course, is a better way of doing it than how it transpired.
And then we see another phone call noted with Amanda probably should be given rather than living there.
Typo, sorry.
15:15. And then you've listed the names of a number of people, Alan, Dan, James, Ash, Kelly. Was that the names of the officers who were at that meeting with MIT?
That's
Or
my
is this somebody else?
No, I think that's my understanding. So I've got 5 officers to attend at work at 1300. So 5 officers were obviously fit for duty on that day in question, and then I've listed 5 names of officers. So yes, my assumption is that those are the 5 officers that attended.
So that would be Alan Payton, Daniel Gibson, James McDonough, Ashley Tomlinson, and Kelly Good. Kelly Good is the name of one of the officers.
Yes, that would be.
That probably instead of
Yeah.
Kelly. Can we move on now, please, to Monday, the 11th of May? So again, you're given an update from Inspector Seath. Did you continue in your role as post-incident manager up to the 11th of May?
Yeah, so I tried to stay involved in my role as post-incident manager because I felt it was appropriate for me to be involved in line with the SOP that stage 4 accounts still hadn't been given, and I thought I had a role to play in that. As I've indicated, those discussions were actually happening directly between PERC and/or PERC reps and the Federation, and so I became sort of less and less involved in that provision of those accounts, to the extent that I didn't know the date that they were provided until you shared it earlier. So my involvement, so the involvement in that week after, as you see by the log, was there was a reasonable amount of discussion that I was involved in, actually prompted by my email to Keith to say, look, I need to be part of this. And from the welfare point of view, there was that sort of handover period with Alan. But yeah, from that Monday, Alan very much is looking after the welfare side, and obviously at that point there was still no resolution around the provision of the statements.
So Alan Seath, as line manager,
Yeah.
effectively takes over the welfare side.
That's right.
And was Monday the 11th of May the last day that you were involved? There's no other entries in your
Yeah.
PIM log?
No, so several days, just a few days later, PERC obviously took my statement and took possession of the PIM log, so there wouldn't have been any other entries after that in any case. But from recollection, there was no substantial involvement because the welfare has been taken care of, and the investigation side and the Federation were engaging about the provision of statements. So I wasn't adding any value in terms of my role.
So you effectively stepped down
Yes,
from
that's
that
right.
point. Now the 11th of May effectively takes us up to 7 days
days.
after the events, which we talked about yesterday
Yes,
when we were
yeah.
looking at the SOP. And as you knew by then, no statements, detailed statements had been provided. Did that expiry of that 7-day period, in a sense, cause you to reflect on whether you could do any more about securing or facilitating statements for the investigation?
No, I've as I sort of touched on, I felt that my influence, the value I was adding, was getting less and less as that first week was going on, that the discussions and the decisions were all being taken out with any forum that I was in or being invited into. I tried to get myself back involved and then the discussions and the conversations moved on into other forum. So I felt I'd done what I could do in terms of the role that I played, and actually I would probably be adding a layer of complexity if I continued being involved because those direct conversations were playing out.
Okay. I'd like to move on now. We could maybe have your inquiry statement on the screen, paragraph 143, please. This is where you mention the nature of the investigation is for the SIO. This was the first day of an incident and the investigation's ongoing. So we're talking about the 3rd of May 2015. And you say, from what we knew, this was absolutely, could have been a criminal investigation into the actions of Sheku Bio prior to any police engagement. This would involve investigating if any crimes were committed. And I'm interested in what it was you're referring to there. Obviously, Mr. Bio died on the 3rd of May. So what do you mean saying that absolutely could have been a criminal investigation into the actions of Mr. Bio?
So I'm referring to the actions prior to the police involvement. So so as per the sit rep on that first Sunday morning, that the sit rep was that there was a male in possession of a machete, as I had written it. That's a criminal act. So there's criminal behaviour that needs to be investigated, notwithstanding all the other angles that need to be investigated as well.
And notwithstanding the fact that the male has died.
So, which is where I've in the paragraph above.
Let's look at that.
Yeah, so
142.
this is an Article 2 Human Rights Act investigation, and that's absolutely the primary purpose of this. And that's, as we touched on yesterday, there's a responsibility on the state to independently investigate any actions of the state that result in the death of any members of that state. Article 2 Human Rights Act. That's what post-instant procedure is born out of, and that's absolutely the primary purpose that PERC have got in investigating this. So I'm not in any way demeaning the serious and significant primary purpose of the investigation by referring to other angles of investigation that are also relevant, potentially relevant.
I understand why there would be an investigation. Mr. Bio was alive, there was police contact, there was restraint, and then he died. And I can understand why that would be part of a criminal investigation. Can you explain why him walking along the road with a knife would be a criminal investigation? Are you saying it was part of the general circumstances?
So what I'm trying to describe here is the lenses of an investigation. So, and I've tried to draw it out in 4 aspects. So the Article 2 human rights investigation is not investigating the criminal acts. It's investigating the use of force of the state, as in the use that might be perfectly justified, legitimate, and so forth. There's still an investigation into that. That's right and proper, and is the primary purpose of this investigation. But that's not a criminal investigation into people's conduct. That's an Article 2 investigation. There is then the responsibility of the Lord Advocate and the Crown Office in relation to the death of any individuals, and they're responsible in relation to the investigation of deaths. So that's a lens of the investigation. So I'm not saying there's 4 separate investigations here. I'm saying there's 4 different lenses of the investigation, and then there is the conduct that has taken place, which until you investigate, you don't know what has or hasn't occurred there. So you need to investigate the circumstances leading up, but you're investigating the circumstances in the broadest sense. And that also then includes the 4th lens, which is the conduct of all the individuals involved. And there may be criminal conduct by civilians, other members of the public in relation to this overarching, as well as conduct of officers. So I suppose I'm just trying to explain that this is actually a really complex investigation, and again, that's why the SIO has a terms of reference that would identify that. The primary purpose is the Article 2. Clearly, human rights, Article 2, is a priority over the rest of it. But you're not just investigating the circumstances that led to the death. You're investigating, well, you are investigating the circumstances that led to the death, but in a broad context with different perspectives.
So,
and that would come out through the terms of reference that an SIO would have.
so just to be clear, because members of the public are listening,
Yeah, absolutely.
this wasn't a criminal investigation because Mr. Bio couldn't be prosecuted, he had
Correct.
passed away. So it's not that type of criminal investigation into any action he took with a knife, but it is an investigation regarding the full circumstances of what led up to his death and the events at Hayfield Road.
Correct.
Thank you. Can I ask you about, you've made a number of comments about the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the impact that that had on your career and the police service. Can you perhaps explain to the chair, what was it about the murder of Stephen Lawrence that had an impact on post-incident procedures and post-incident management?
So I was asked in the inquiry statement around policing and race more generally in a broader sense to my specific role on the day, and you know, one of the important points that I think it's important for the inquiry to understand is, you know, February 1999 was the Macpherson report, which is the month and year that I joined policing, and that you know, throughout my career, that not just from the media reporting around that, but throughout my career, that has been used to inform policing practice and policy, to improve policing practice and policy in relation to not just the specifics of race relations and police engagement, but more generally in terms of how we deal with critical incidents. So I suppose there's probably two things that came out of the tragedy and the Macpherson report. One, from a UK policing point of view, is around the critical incident management, and we've talked about this being declared a critical incident. So critical incident management, and in Scotland, the SOP that evolved out of that. And indeed, there's a training course that Police Scotland also put in place around critical incident management. All of that stems back to you know, the tragedy around Stephen Lawrence and the Macpherson report. So that's sort of well embedded in policing learning, organisational learning, and indeed has influenced policy in terms of critical incident policy, and has influenced training in terms of a training course that focuses around critical incident management and focuses around the scenario that we use in Scotland is around race relations and some of the challenges of policing in that environment. So there's a direct correlation actually from that inquiry, that report, and how policing has progressed as an organisation and how staff have been trained and so on. I've sort of grown up in policing during that whole time period, and therefore it's kind of been embedded in all the training you know, and development that I've done over the years. The other, from a Scottish point of view, the other thing that evolved out of Macpherson report was our own equivalent of the Black Police Officers Association. So Semper Scotland was, you know, the ideas and the embryo of that came out of the Scottish discussion from the Macpherson report. And, you know, through workshops and so on, Semper Scotland was created, which is our staff association for black police officers. So both of them, and they're both really powerful. You know, one from an operational, critical incident management from an operational delivery perspective is a really is a really important tool for how we deliver our operational policing response. And from a inclusion, diversity perspective, Semper Scotland are a key stakeholder and a key contributor to how we take forward equality and diversity issues in policing. So there's, and there's really direct and credible links there between that tragedy in London and how policing has evolved across the UK and in Scotland.
And is there a correlation between, you've talked about the Macpherson report, you've talked about critical incident. Is there a correlation between critical incident and post-incident procedures?
Not directly, but so as we discussed yesterday, the evolution of post-incident procedures is really from firearms operations and police discharge of firearms and the way that officers have been dealt with in the aftermath of firearms incidents. That's really the evolution of post-incident procedure, but there's a clear read across interdependency in terms of a critical incident could be, and it's only could be one that has involved a number of officers in some of the criticality of that incident. It might not be, because the critical incident could have evolved from an incident in society and the police are then involved in, but it could evolve, as it did in this example, it could evolve from an interaction, and therefore post-incident procedure is an important part of that aspect. And so the two are interdependent, but they're not, they can operate in isolation and they can operate together, if that
So there's not a direct correlation between the Macpherson report and critical incident and the role of post-incident manager in post-incident procedures.
Yeah, and well, maybe the easy way to describe it is you want two decisions. So there will be a decision around, is this a critical incident, yes or no, implementing critical incident procedures and so on. Is this applicable, is post-incident management applicable to this, yes or no, implement those procedures. But they are, sort of by their very nature, they're kind of self-supporting, I suppose would be the way to describe it.
They could both be implemented where there's serious incidents,
Yeah.
and so they could coexist.
Yes, absolutely.
You also talk in your statement about equality impact assessments. This is at paragraph 44.
Thanks.
And we'll get that on the screen. And you talk about equality impact assessments. Any new policy or procedure is impact assessed against equality, protected characteristics and human rights. That's what we're doing now in practice to avoid institutional discrimination against protected characteristics. The Lawrence inquiry has been hugely influential in driving change between where we've been and where we are now. And can you tell me, what's your involvement, if any, in carrying out equality impact assessments?
So probably two strands, and it depends, I guess, which bit of my career. So I have been involved in the creation of policies for certain aspects of policing, and then one of the responsibilities in terms of creating a policy is carrying out an equality impact assessment. My new role will probably take me back into that sort of area as well. I've also, in a sort of a more operational context, I've been involved in terms of being a consultee around that. So there's an element of engagement, internal and external engagement with equality impact assessments. And indeed, in a previous role, Scotland has an Islands Act, which talks about discriminatory policies in terms of the Scottish Islands, and so there's a need to impact assess policing policies on actually the remote and rural islands as well, and that was part of my command responsibility. So
you were formerly a commander at Highlands,
in Highlands and Islands,
and
yeah.
Islands.
So it was kind of very relevant to that role. I've been involved, so I'm not the author of them, but some of my team might be the author of them, and I might be a consultee in them. But that's almost like the policy and the tool that can drive equality through the policy side of policing, which of course was the you know, the McPherson report talked about that institutional racism and how that is, you know, how policies and procedures can discriminate not through a sort of a direct sort of act of racism, but by a discriminatory aspect that hasn't been considered. So the tool to try and overcome that, or to mitigate that, is the equality impact assessment.
So seeking examples perhaps of where discrimination could arise on a more subtle level.
Yes.
And how are the outcomes of equality impact assessments communicated? You've talked about having been involved or contributed to these. How are the results of that then communicated back to officers?
So it is actually, it is a document that sits, so if there's a new policy, it's a document set that sits behind it, so that impact, but actually an equality impact assessment should take place during the sort of the life cycle of developing the policy. So it's a feedback loop. So if you consult on, or if you either identify something or consult on it, and there is some sort of impact on a protected characteristic, then obviously you should change the policy. So it's not a, we've done this policy, do the impact assessment, oh look, it's not compliant. It's a case of, it's part of the process of policy development that should feed back into, right, we need to change that policy because actually it's impacting this demographic or that.
So as new information may come to light or
Yeah.
examples are highlighted, that causes a review to take place.
And all
It
policies
sounds-
have review dates and so on associated with them.
It sounds like a similar model to the evidence we've heard about the national decision-making model, where new information comes in and reviews are ongoing. Is that the same sort of pattern?
Yeah, so national decision model is a very operationally focused decision model and process and so on, whereas equality impact assessments is a more formal policy development sort of organisational document set and process.
Can you think, in your experience, of any policies that were changed because of concerns that were highlighted as a result of these assessments?
So I don't have direct experience of that that would be helpful. There have been, so in my former role, as you touched on, the island impact assessment did change more some of the language that was used in some of the policies rather than necessarily the detail of them. But there's nothing that's kind of leaping out that would demonstrate it well, I'm afraid, sorry.
Anything that you've come across in relation to race? You've talked about protected characteristics. Can you think of anything?
Not that I've been directly involved in, sorry.
Is there a department or a part of the organisation that deals with equality impact
Yeah.
assessments? Or is it general that various officers across Police Scotland have to
So
do
we have a policy unit that would coordinate. So typically, so a policy would be created both by the subject matter experts in terms of whatever the area of policy was. So you need a feed in from those individuals, and also the policy unit to just initiate things like equality impact assessments, make sure the governance processes are right and so on. So yeah.
And they would be handled by that policy unit?
Indeed.
You mention in paragraph 45, which we could put on the screen, that by the time of the incident involving Sheku in 2015, you say we'd already come some way since Stephen Lawrence. The Stephen Lawrence investigation and inquiry played out in the decade before. Can you identify the main changes in policing between the Stephen Lawrence report, which you've described as 1999, and 2015?
Yeah, so I think the two pillars that I would identify are critical incident management SOP and the Simplexity training that I referred to. So we had a specific 3-day course that was evolved for Police Scotland to train managers around critical incident management. So that's the main, that's a really significant change from that led prior to this, and then the Semper Scotland one. So those are the two, in my mind, those are the two most obvious sort of practical examples of things that have changed organisationally based on that.
And simplexity is the
Yeah.
critical incident management.
Yes, and it's complex, hence the...
Was there, we've heard some evidence that there was also training rolled out to all officers in Police Scotland after the Macpherson report into Stephen Lawrence's murder. Did you take part in that training?
Yeah, so so throughout my career, there've been various courses with, and we touched on my training record before. There's a number of courses in there that sort of specific equality, diversity courses that I've undertaken, and equally as part of leadership training. Equality and diversity is referenced within leadership training. So it's. The short answer is yes. There's been a significant amount of training that I've received over the years, from not just up to 2015, but well beyond. It's a feature of police training in terms of equality and diversity, and there's been standalone courses that have been done. So I think in my statement I reference a one-day course. When we were Tayside Police, they ran a one-day course program that every single officer went on. I've attended courses at the police college that certain ranks attended, and had a focus around equality and diversity issues. So and then, as I say, more generally in the leadership programs that I've been on at various ranks, there's always an angle, because equality and diversity is a leadership issue. So therefore, it's part of leadership training.
Right. And what about if you're not considering or undertaking leadership training? Have there been courses for constables who don't have plans to seek promotion?
Yeah. So that course I referred to when I was in Tayside Police. I think I was a constable when I went on it, actually. So that was rolled out to the whole organisation.
Do you mean Tayside, or do you mean Police Scotland?
Sorry, that was Tayside Police example. Actually, more recently, there's a training package that, again, an update around equality, diversity and inclusion has been rolled out across the whole organisation again, and every member of staff needs to complete, police officers and police staff needs to complete that. So, is that
an e-learning programme called Moodle?
That's right, it is.
Yeah. And in relation, thinking back to training in relation to the Macpherson report, the Stephen Lawrence murder, and institutional racism and that type of thing. We've heard evidence that there was a course rolled out after that report for all members of Police Scotland. Do you remember attending that?
So Police Scotland was obviously 2013, and Macpherson was... So I think it must have been
absolutely
legacy...
Right to correct me. Legacy forces, but rolled out across Scotland rather than Police Scotland.
Yeah, so sorry.
You're absolutely right.
I wouldn't have had the knowledge of how widely that programme was rolled out, but I obviously took part in that programme within Tayside Police as it was at that point. But if it was rolled out across Scotland, then that would be right. Was
that ever repeated, that course?
So not that I'm aware of. But there have been a number of other courses around equality and diversity that have been put in place. So,
what have been the main learning points that you've learned in relation to equality and diversity over the years? Can you summarise those?
So. It's not an easy question to summarise and answer. My personal learning has been around the leadership role that it is, and what I mean by that is that, in fact, go back a stage. So the importance of equality and diversity in policing is that it's twofold. One, we should represent the communities which we serve, and as an organisation we want to grow and develop in terms of the talent that we have within the organisation. You can only do both of those things if you are an inclusive organisation, if you're a diverse organisation, and therefore the fundamental side of that is that there is equality running through the organisation. So as and this is society is ever evolving in this space as well, and we do reflect society. So we're not a perfect organisation, and therefore we're on a journey in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion, which is why you have to both sort of repeat training or change the way you do it, so that we touched on, is a training course the best way to train? Well, actually, it's lived experience is a better way. So, and that's why it's a leadership role. So this is about leaders at every single rank in the organisation being inclusive, to encourage diversity. So if you're an inclusive organisation, you encourage diversity through recruitment. If you're a diverse and inclusive organisation, your engagement with communities is better, and therefore, well, again, it's another feedback loop, isn't it? So if you engage with communities in an improved way, you increase public trust and confidence in policing. Actually, you also increase the recruitment pool of people that are then interested in policing, because they then see it as a career for them rather than maybe a career over here. So the two interplay continually in terms of the internal benefits of diversity and inclusion, and also the community engagement aspects and the representing the community and serving the community and public trust and confidence in community. So for all of those reasons, that's why this is a leadership role at every single rank in the organisation. And obviously I've played my part in the various leadership roles that I've had. So it's much more than training. This is about how we operate as an organisation. This is about how we don't shy away from errors that we've made, that we learn from them, and that we try and implement and improve the way that we do our business. And I suppose, again, personal reflection is and some personal learning is around that topic of unconscious bias. So unconscious bias is an issue for society. It's an issue for everyone in this room. Everyone has unconscious bias. And the importance is that people recognise that obviously it can't become conscious bias, because then it's not unconscious bias, but recognise that unconscious bias is a thing, and recognise how it might be affecting your thought process, your decision-making process, your engagement processes. So it's massively important. So it's important for communication on a one-to-one level. It's important for communication on an organisation to society level. And it's important for an organisation from an internal recruitment, retention, better organisation, well-being approach as well. So,
in relation to unconscious bias, as part of the training that you've undertaken over the years, have you been taught about unconscious bias?
Yes, you could probably tell that, couldn't you? That
Yes.
It is something, and that's why that education piece is important, because you only know what you know. So there is, and actually, so the unconscious bias bit is part of we've got something called inclusion moments in the organisation, which are small sort of clips and video clips that generate discussion in group settings. So one of those inclusion moments is around unconscious bias, which we've rolled out across the organisation in terms of through command teams and into team briefings and so on.
How recent are these inclusion moments being part of the training?
Well, over the last couple of years, I think they've been on the go. Right. So they've been trialled and then sort of more widely available.
In 2015, was unconscious bias being taught at that stage?
I don't know the answer to that. We would need to look back on sort of training records. I can't remember when.
We're going to hear more evidence about training
right.
at a separate hearing.
I'm not a training expert.
Okay.
So.
In your experience, was it only on the leadership courses that you attended that you heard about unconscious bias?
No, so those inclusion moments that I'm referring to are deliberately designed so that you can take them and put them into any context. So actually, that it's out of a training space and into more of an informal briefing discussion space within a workplace. So you might spend 10 minutes at the beginning of a shift and go through an inclusion moment, which could be on a variety of topics, but the one we're talking about is unconscious bias. So.
And yes, and that wasn't being done in 2015?
No.
To what extent was race part of the training that was delivered in 2015? Or up to the point of 2015?
I mean, again, you might get better evidence from somebody that's been intimately involved in that development of training products over the years. Obviously, the Equality Act came in 2010, and so now I know you're going to ask, were you trained on that? So I can't recall if I received specific training on that, or if that is a professional development of myself in terms of my understanding of that.
We've got your training records. You've got a hard copy of those in the papers in your folder. I don't know if that would help you answer this.
I don't think the course will name check the detail of this, but I suppose the point I'm trying to make is Equality Act in 2010 was there was certainly awareness raising within the organisation about the Equality Act. Now, if that was specific training course or if that was more broader awareness raising, I can't recall. But of course, the Equality Act brings in protected characteristics, one of which is race. So, to my mind, by 2015, the duties under the Equality Act would be widely understood in policing. I can't be specific if that's a training course or if that's general awareness or a combination of both. But there's a 5-year period from that act coming into existence to the incident we're talking about, where the knowledge of that across the organisation would be much wider, and specific courses did focus in on, you know, on that act and the legal duties within it, and the concept of protected characteristics and discrimination around those protected characteristics.
And would that be across the board rather than just particular areas? Or are you not able to answer that?
I'm probably not best placed to answer that, to be honest.
In terms of your own personal training into unconscious bias, were you asked to hold a mirror up to yourself or to reflect on your own unconscious bias? And if you were asked to do that, could you identify unconscious bias?
So everyone has unconscious bias, and actually, I mean, there are some really simple sort of questions you ask yourself. So you walk onto a plane and the pilot says hello to you. Tell me what gender the pilot was. What did the pilot look like? And then straight away your unconscious bias comes, because majority of people will say it was a male, white male. So there's a classic example of unconscious bias. The consultant doctor comes in to speak to you about an operation. Describe the doctor. And people will generally say a white male. So these are classics, and this isn't just me. This is society that would have these unconscious bias. So I'm aware of those kind of things.
Yeah. And what does the training do in terms of helping you identify those biases and then helping you guard against that in your day-to-day work?
Yeah, so I think from my understanding, and I'm not a training expert in unconscious bias, so from my understanding is that it's not a case of trying to remove unconscious bias from every person and in society and so on. It's actually the recognition that they exist. So if you recognize that unconscious bias exists, and you may have them, and there isn't, as far as I'm aware, there isn't some sort of test that you do and therefore you identify all your unconscious bias because then they're all conscious bias, etc. So you just need to recognize that this is a thing that can happen, and then how it impacts. So it's more about and how does it impact. So you need to recognize that when I'm carrying out this engagement, in terms of either from a policing point of view, an element of operational delivery, importantly, community engagement, trying to resolve a community issue, that there may be unconscious bias that is playing out. So what that then feeds into is your engagement strategy. So this is actually all about listening. So the way to overcome unconscious bias is to listen to other opinions. So I might be in a situation and might form an opinion of a situation. I might not realise it's unconscious biases that I'm forming that opinion of the situation. That I feel that that's my professional judgment forming that opinion. So that's why you need to triangulate that with listening to someone else, to take in an alternative perspective, and then you suddenly realise that how you were observing something, your judgment on something is merely your judgment on something. And this is how it links directly back into a diverse workforce, because every one of us has a different unconscious bias. So if you put the problem into a group and you get different people looking at that problem from different perspectives, and you listen to those perspectives, then you will overcome unconscious bias through that engagement and that diverse thinking. And
Thank you. Would that be inappropriate?
Very well, we'll stop for lunch and sit at 2 o'clock.